Was Dresden packed with refugees on the 13th or 14th of February 1945? This assumption is based on the mass flood of people from Silesia as the Soviets advanced. The previous week the Red Army had crossed the Oder River. It was now in the German heartlands and there was mass panic to escape, particularly after the brutal campaign that the Nazi forces had waged in the USSR. Many Germans feared revenge, and after what had happened in East Prussia, they had good reason to fear revenge. However, I do not think that there was a huge influx of refugees in Dresden, and certainly not the hundreds of thousands that we sometimes hear about. Witnesses do not report masses of refugees. We often hear of 500 or 600,000 people, but where would this number of people go? This would mean doubling of the population. Each family in Dresden would have to take in several people, and there's no record of this. I do not doubt that refugees were housed in the military barracks, which had a capacity of around 24,000 people just after World War I. These barracks certainly would have housed extra people, and I have also no doubt that the number of people housed there would have increased, given the desperate situation that Hitler's war had led the German people into. However, the barracks were not damaged by the bombing. Refugees logically would have clustered around the railway station. The railway station offered water, toilets, and a warm place to stay, but there is a limit to the amount of people who can stay in waiting rooms. Thousands maybe, but not hundreds of thousands, as some would have us believe. Eyewitnesses have said that the waiting rooms were packed, as always, but not that there were masses of people loitering in the nearby streets. There is no record of people living in the parks or the streets of the city in the winter of 1944-1945. People from outside could only reside in Dresden and get a ration card if they had somewhere to live and a job to go to. This situation was made more difficult in December 1944, when it was forbidden for newcomers to take up residence in the city. This means that only newcomers who arrived before the Soviet winter offensive, when the Red Army stood on the Vistula River in central Poland, were welcome. So with no rations and no food, what would refugees have done? People would have received food from the local social security services and charities whilst in transit, but only enough to keep them going. No doubt some people were put up by friends, but in the circumstances it would have been very difficult even to find friends and let them know. On the 1st of January 1945, the city was declared a defence area, one step down from being a fortress city. This was designated for cities with no defences, either real or imagined. Hitler sometimes pretended that cities did have fortifications, and he declared them fortresses. However, the defence area was declared by Guderian, who was a bit more aware of military matters than the Führer. For refugees, this would have made the situation even more difficult if they were thinking of moving to Dresden. Being a defence zone meant that they would be moved on. Of course, some trains would have come into Dresden. Maybe some would have stopped there. But why would people get off if they could not find housing and food, and they knew this? And they also knew that the Red Army was behind. The only reason that they would get off was because the train was not going any further. If they were panicking to get out of the east, they would go as far west as possible. Is there any evidence for this? I've spoken to people who were on refugee trains coming from Eastern Germany. They told me that they stayed on the train until it stopped. Sometimes it was in the middle of a field somewhere, other times it was a town or a terminal station. The fact of the matter is that the authorities in Dresden had not issued hundreds of thousands of ration cards, nor allocated housing for this amount of people. I do not doubt that there were refugees in Dresden, maybe thousands of people, but not the huge numbers that have been quoted by some. I think that the story that Dresden was packed with refugees is a myth. Nonetheless, it cannot be ignored that the city was flattened, and much of it stayed that way throughout the Soviet occupation. Furthermore, some 25 to 35,000 people were killed in horrendous circumstances, many of them by asphyxiation, and most of the survivors would have had PTSD for the rest of their lives. The number of 25 to 35,000 people dead is absolutely terrible in itself. What needs to be also remembered is that this was a direct consequence of the war and the hate that the National Socialist ideology unleashed upon the world. And without this war and hate, then the bombing wouldn't have occurred in the first place.